John Skelton, ca. 1460 to 1529, is the most interesting and original of all the transitional poets who, while considering themselves in the tradition of Chaucer, Gower, and Lydgate, are in fact Janus-faced, looking both to the medieval past and to the Renaissance future. As a satirist, Skelton attacks the abuses of courtly life, new fashions in thought, religion and behavior, personal enemies, Scots, and aspects of the contemporary scene which he found annoying. The Bourge of Court is a satire of court life in the traditional rhyme royal stanza, combining traditional medieval allegorical figures with a ship of fool's device, the characters being sometimes allegorical personages and sometimes lively representatives of the contemporary scene. Less traditional in form and content is Speak Parrot, a bubbling satirical piece mostly in rhyme royal but with some parts in other meters. The poet speaks through the bird in a characteristic mixture of bitterness and clowning. But Colin Clout and Why Come Ye Not to Court represent his most characteristic and original satirical vein. The verse here is that short two-beat line which has become known as Skeltonics. The poems move with breathless abandon from point to point, highly personal in tone, deliberately discursive in progression, mingling fierce abuse, clowning humor, and bitter irony. Latin tags and even whole passages in rhymed Latin couplets, echoes or parodies of the church liturgy or of the arguments of the schoolmen, are sprinkled freely among the wild and whirling verses. The life, the abandon, the high spirits, the reckless vitality of these pieces make them utterly unlike anything that English literature had yet produced. In the book of Philip Sparrow he uses a similar technique to lament the loss of a young girl's pet sparrow. The lament is put into the mouth of the girl, and ends with Skelton's own tribute to the girl's charm and beauty. Its parody of the office for the dead and other aspects of the Latin liturgy of the Church is done with a cheerful recklessness reminiscent of the Goliardic literature of the Middle Ages. The verse itself is crudely accentual, whether it derives from the breakup of a longer line or from medieval Latin poetry or from another source cannot be precisely determined, but it moves with extraordinary speed and vigor. So meantime he wold gaspe van he survey a waspe, a fly or a gnat, he wold fly at that and brightly he wold punt van he saw an ant. Lord, how he wold pry alter the butterfly. Lord, how he wold hop alter the grasshopper. And when I sired, pbyp, fipe, then he wold lepe and skype, and take me by the lyp. Alas, it wyll me slo. That Philip is gone me fro. See in Ike 30 E1 I was ever at ease. The proton dis CLARNAV, when I survey my sparrow die. The color and life of Skelton's most characteristic verse is perhaps best seen in the Tunning of Eleanor Rumming, a remarkable description of an alewife and the goings-on in her alehouse. Come whoso wyll to Eleanor on the hyll, with, fill the cup, fyll, and sit there by style, early and jar. Thither cometh Kate, Sisley, and Sare, with their legs bare, and also their fate hardly full and sweet, with their helles dagged, their kyratels all to iagged, their smocks all to ragged, with litters and tatters, bringy dustures and platters. With all their might ninge to Eleanor reminge, to have of her to ninge. She lenate them of the same, and thus budgeoneth the game. His garland of laurel is an elaborate set piece in praise of himself. Fame and palace discuss his qualifications. Gower, Chaucer, and Lydgate hail him. A group of noble ladies make a laurel wreath with which to crown him. The incidental lyrics addressed to these ladies are in a new vein of lyrical tenderness. Notably that addressed to Marjorie Wentworth, with Margarine Jettle, I the hovre of good Jihad. Embroidered the mantle is of your maidenhide. Magnificence is a morality play with allegorical characters, showing how magnificence is deceived and undone by vices, conquered by adversity, and finally redeemed by good hope and perseverance. It is aimed at Woolsey, but also has its general application. Skelton moved in a humanist atmosphere without fully realizing it. His attire was conservative in intention but in fact revolutionary in unconscious implication. His fiercely individual temperament, the vigor which he infused into his rough accentual verse, his ambiguous relation with the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII, his attacks both on church abusers and on radical reformers like Wycliffe and Luther, his bitter feuds with so many of his contemporaries, his strange mixtures of anger and tenderness, of self-conceit and moral indignation, of prophetic elevation and low abuse, show a highly individual temperament coping in a strongly individual way with some of the bewildering crosscurrents in the civilization of his day. His lively and unpolished verse and his violently personal manner attracted English poets in the 1920s and 1930s who were looking for a style in which to express similar reactions. And Pope's verdict of beastly Skelton has in recent times been enthusiastically reversed. Meanwhile, the revival of interest in feudal ideals which, _Cali but understandably, accompanied the final decay of feudalism in England, produced in the prose Arthurian tales of Sir Thomas Malory the greatest of all its monuments. Malory, who appears to have been a mid-15th century knight of lawless behavior who wrote his stories in prison, turned first the English alliterative romance known as Mart Arthur, and then a variety of French romances about Arthur's knights, into a series of tales of Arthur and his knights in which the ideals of practical chivalry replaced the sentimental and doctrinal elements which figure so prominently in his French sources. He cut his way through the tangle of complexly interwoven tales, fitted together in pieces like a Chinese puzzle, with which his originals so often presented him, and, to use Caxton's term, reduced his material to a coherent group of related stories in which incidents followed each other with less interruption and the emphasis was on action and motive rather than on sentiment or doctrine. Caxton published the work in 1485, giving it a false unity by applying the title of the last group of stories, the Mart Arthur Sans Guerdon, to the whole collection. The discovery in 1934 of the Winchester MS of Malory's stories makes it clear that Le Morte d'Arthur is Caxton's title for the whole, not Malory's. Malory's work is in 8 tales or groups of tales, each group originally written separately as an independent work, except for the 6th and 7th, which are explicitly linked in Malory's colophon to the 6th. The first, though apparently the second in order of writing, is the comprehensive tale of King Arthur. It begins with the death of Uther Pendragon and Arthur's accession, and tells of Arthur's victorious wars against rebels and hostile neighbors, the stories of Balin, Gawain, Tor and Pelena, much about Merlin, the plottings of Morgan I.e. Fay, Arthur's half-sister, and a group of adventures engaged in by Gawain, Ewain, and Mahald. The second group, the tale of the noble King Arthur that was emperor himself through the dignity of his hands, was apparently the first to be written and derives from the alliterative Morte Arthur. It tells of Arthur's struggle against the claims of Rome, the battle between Arthur and Lucius, Arthur's triumph and coronation as emperor in Rome. The third, the noble tale of Sir Launcelot du Lake, turns for its hero from Arthur to Sir Lancelot, who appears here, not as the lover of Guinevere, but as an active and gallant knight who proceeds from adventure to adventure before returning to King Arthur's court, where the knights whom he has overcome testify to his prowess. The tale of Sir Gareth of Orkney follows. It is a characteristic story, from an unknown French source, of a questing knight whose adventures are rounded off by his wedding the Lady Lynette, whom he has championed and who at first scorned him. with feasting and jousting. The Book of Sir Tristram the Lyonese is the fifth. It is a simplified and reduced version of the French prose romance of Tristan, with the Grail material omitted. The love of Tristram, Tristan, and Isolde, Isolde, treated with emotional gusts and with no sense of doom, Tristram's adventures and achievements as a knight of the Round Table emphasized. And the lovers left at the end happily in joyous guard. Even so, Malory's Book of Sir Tristram is far from being a single tale. It is made up of many separate adventures, and is divided into 17 parts, easily the long-est of Malory's 7 books. The Tale of the Sunk Grail is Malory's 5th book. It is translated from the French Quest del Saint Graal, but emphasizes what might be called chivalric humanism as the underlying ethical pattern, at the expense of the religious. Lancelot is less the repentant sinner of the French original than the former hero of the Round Table, whose chivalric ideals are never made to appear as basically inimical to the truly religious life. Malory plays down the basic dichotomy between Carbonek and Camelot, so important in the quest, though of course something of it does come through from his original. The Book of Sir Launcelot and Queen Guinevere is partly based on the French Morte d'Arthur, the final branch of the prose Arthurian cycle. This goes together with the final book, the most piteous tale of the Morte d'Arthur sans Guerdon, based partly on the Morte d'Arthur and partly on the English stanzaic Morte d'Arthur. And the two books again show Maloty's characteristic minimizing of the religious in favor of the chivalric moral. Lancelot loves both his mistress and his king. These two chivalric loyalties are incompatible, and in the end they destroy him. It is not the clash between courtly love and heavenly love so much as the clash between courtly love and feudal loyalty that interests Malory. Here, indeed, the sense of doom rises. Lancelot becomes involved in battle against those he loves. And in the end, with the Round Table destroyed, Arthur, hurt to the death, in the final battle in which the treacherous Mordred is slain, and Guinevere retired to a nunnery, Lancelot decides to forsake the world too, out of love and despair rather than from a religious impulse. Guinevere dies repentant, Lancelot follows soon after, and Sir Ector speaks his obituary. Launcelot, he sighed, thou were head of all Christian mighties. And now I dare say, sighed Sir Ector, thou Sir Launcelot, there thou liest, that thou were never matched of Etly Congties Hande. And thou wert the curtest lmyght that ever bare shelter. And thou wert the truest friend to thy lover that ever bestrayed or, and thou wert the truest lover of a sinful man that ever loved woman. And thou wert the kindest man that ever strake with sword. And thou wert the godliest person that ever came among praise of Congties. And thou was the makest man and the gentlest that ever ate in Bene among ladies. And thou wert be sternest cunt to thy mortal foe that ever put spare in the reest. It ends in desolation, with no comfort but memory of knightly deeds once done. Malory's prose style, which moves with a simple cogency always perfectly adapted to the narrative line which he is developing, is not easily placed in the history of English prose. He is outside the tradition of English devotional prose which continues from Anglo-Saxon times to the Tudor and Elizabethan translations of the Bible. He begins by capturing something of the rhythms and using some of the alliterative devices of Middle English alliterative verse as represented by the verse romance Morte d'Arthur. He simplifies, tightens up, adds weight and precision and, at the same time, a conversational flow. He learns as he writes. And the later books show a fine ease in dialogue together with a dignity and eloquence which derive at least in part from the heroic element in the Morte d'Arthur. The flow is simple enough, marked by such conjunctions as and, for, but, then, and therefore, tilde. The underlying rhythms provide a quiet emotional groundswell to the narrative. The dialogue is lively and often captures the individual quality of a character. The accounts of action rise and fall with a restrained epic movement which has quiet gravity without magniloquence. The result of it all is an impressive summing up of the matter of Britain, as seen through the perspective of the Indian summer of the age of chivalry, excessive sentiment, the pure devotional note, and overabundant narrative complication are equally pruned away, and Mallory gives us the Arthurian stories set to an uncomplicated chivalric morality. But the epic note does not really belong to these nostalgic stories of a lost way of life. The defects of the code are manifest in the actions which are based on it, and in the end the heroic key is modulated into elegy. It is paradoxical that William Caxton, who brought the art of printing to England, should have been so interested in chivalry and old romance. But the late 15th and early 16th century was a transitional period in which all sorts of paradoxical things still are likely to happen. The work of Berkeley and Hawes showed both old medieval modes and new humanist influences. Humanism itself was one element in that complex movement we call the Renaissance. A movement whose reality has recently been questioned but which certainly was real, though its manifestations were not as sudden nor its causes as simple as was once thought. The world of medieval Christendom, set against the militant Moslem world, which bounded it on the south and east, had a significant religious and cultural uniformity. Its intellectual and imaginative boundaries were limited, the scholar moving within the limits of Latinitas, the philosopher and the scientist working deductively on truths taken from authority. The poet rendering his vision of past and present through notions of order and significance common to the whole of medieval Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, we know, was never more than an ideal. But the ideal represented a view of history and of society that lay behind most of the superficially differing attitudes which intelligent men in the Middle Ages expressed. The shift from the view of the Roman Empire as divinely ordained machinery for the Christianizing of the Western world to a view of the pagan culture of Greece and Rome as something more civilized, more splendid, more fully illustrative of what man can make of himself by cultivation of the arts and sciences than any subsequent phase of history, represented a real revolution in thought. And while it would be wrong to see this shift as simply the rapid result of the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, with the consequent emigration of Greek-speaking Christians from the Eastern Empire to Italy, for it was a slow process that had been going on since long before 1453, it would be ridiculous to assert that because the movement was gradual it did not take place. The writing of history is impossible without making generalizations, and it is impossible to make generalizations unless one deliberately cultivates the proper perspective. A cause is known as a cause by its effect. If looked at by itself it is simply an isolated phenomenon, and if looked at with reference to preceding events it becomes itself an effect. History is continuous, movements are arbitrary categories of the historian, but significant changes do occur, attitudes do alter radically, the old order does give place to the new. And the Renaissance is not a fiction of the historian's imagination. Medieval Christendom established itself in the chaos that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. It took over what it could from the Roman world, compromised where it had to with both old pagan and new barbarian, and achieved a synthesis in which the thought and institutions of the classical world played a certain limited part. Humanism, that movement which represented the desire to recover the purest ideals of Greek and Latin expression and to assimilate the most civilized aspects of classical thought, was essentially an attempt to get behind the medieval synthesis, to approach the original sources of classical culture directly, not through the medium of clerical Latinitas. Italy had known this movement since the 40th century, and long before it reached England it had exerted its influence on Italian literature. North of the Alps, the humanist movement became more directly involved in religious and moral questions. The ambitious and ubiquitous machinery of the medieval church was ceasing to function effectively. Satire of clerical abuses, amusedly ironical in Chaucer, soon swelled to an angry and bitter chorus. And this in turn encouraged the avant-garde to turn to the secular thought of the classical world for guidance and enlightenment. That secular thought, touched with the moral earnestness of Christian protest against abuses of Christian institutions, produced a school of Christian humanists which was to include reformers who remained within the Roman Catholic fold as well as Protestants. It must be remembered, too, that the New Learning, as it was often called till the end of the 16th century, encouraged the study of Hebrew as well as of Latin and Greek, and that the great German humanist Reuchlin was even more important for the development of Hebrew studies in Europe than the great Dutch humanist Erasmus was for the study of Greek. Hebrew and Greek, the languages of the Old and New Testaments respectively, were essential tools in any new approach to the Bible. If pre-Protestant reforming thought demanded vernacular Bible translation, it was the new scholarship of the humanists that eventually made that translation possible from the original sources. Thus humanism in spite of itself was drawn into new religious movements. We have already noted the changes in the economic basis of society that were bringing about the end of feudalism. In the towns, a new upper class of merchants and professional men joined hands with the landowners in the country, where a prospering gentry were enclosing common land in the interests of sheep farming, too. The distress of the peasants who were thus deprived of the opportunity of tilling the soil and forced to roam the countryside in search of work. Individualism asserted itself in economic as in other area 5. The political genius of Henry VII, whose accession to the throne in 1485 after his victory over Richard III brought to an end the Wars of the Roses and ushered in the new Tudor despotism, enabled him to win the loyalty of merchant, professional man, gentry, and nobility alike, and so to maintain a political stability in the country of which it was in desperate need, and at his death to leave a secure throne to his son. Henry VII thought of himself as a medieval monarch, re-establishing a medieval monarchy, and did not see the implied 3 tildetions of his own reign. He was no friend to humanists. But with the accession of Henry VIII in 1509, the humanists in England had their chance, and the early years of his reign were years of promise and excitement for English culture. The scene changed in the latter part of Henry's reign, when Henry's insistence on divorce from Catherine of Aragon, his break with Rome, his suppression of the monasteries and the consequent destruction of so many English art treasure 5, and his assumption of the supreme headship of the English Church lost him the approval of such a moderate Catholic humanist as Sir Thomas More, whose execution for high treason in 1535 marked the end of Henry's alliance with the most attractive elements of contemporary humanism and arrested the humanist movement in England for a generation. More, scholar, statesman, diplomat, political theorist, the ideal commonwealth described in his Latin work Utopia represents a humanist rather than a Christian conception of the state. And patron of the arts, represented, although, was best in the new ideal of culture. His piety led him to seek to purify, rather than radically to reorganize, the church. And he remained devoted to papal supremacy. Like Erasmus, he wished to remove corruption without changing theological doctrine or ecclesiastical structure. But unlike the Dutch humanist, he became involved in practical affairs to his own undoing. He remains the glory and the tragedy of Henry VIII's reign. The New Learning had made itself felt in England as early as the 15th century, but these early manifestations left no permanent mark. John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, William Grey, later Bishop of Ely, John Free of Balliol College, Oxford, and John Gunthorpe, later Dean of Wells, all visited Italy in the latter part of the 15th century and returned with Latin manuscripts which they left to Oxford College libraries. But it was not until the introduction of Greek learning into England that a more permanent enthusiasm for classical scholarship was aroused. Thomas Linacre, William Grocyn, who returned from Italy in 1490 to teach Greek at Oxford, and William Latimer, put Greek studies on a firm footing at Oxford. While at Cambridge the teaching of Greek by Erasmus from 1510 to 1513 gave a great impetus to Greek studies. John Colet, who had studied in Paris and Italy and was a friend of Erasmus, lectured on the New Testament at Oxford at the turn of the century and in 1510, then Dean of St. Paul's, endowed the Cathedral School of St. Paul's to bring the new learning into secondary education. Richard Croke, who had studied Greek at Oxford with Grocyn and then studied at Paris and lectured at several continental universities, returned to Cambridge in 1518, where, the following year, he was appointed reader in Greek. He was succeeded by Sir Thomas Smith, and in 1540, when 5 new Regius chairs were founded by Henry, Smith got that of civil law, while Sir John Daiches'a became professor of Greek. Daiches'a, hailed by Milton in one of his sonnets as having taught Cambridge and King Edward Greek, later became tutor to the young King Edward VI. He did more than any other single person to make Greek studies popular in England. The history of scholarship becomes important for the history of literature at this time because the new classical scholarship meant the establishment of direct contact with the achievements of classical culture, and this in turn meant not only new ideals in literary style but new concepts of civilization and a sense that the Middle Ages had represented a vast deflection of progress of the arts and sciences off their true course. Further, the recovery of Greek science, which was one of the chief achievements of humanism, too little realized, meant that Renaissance science could begin where Greek science had left off. Astronomy, physics, and medicine profited by this renewed contact with Greek thought. The scientific discoveries of the 16th and 17th centuries were made possible by the work of the 15th century humanists. In the Middle Ages, Greek science, and indeed, much Greek philosophy, was only available in fragmentary and often distorted form through Latin translations from the Arabic, for the Muslim world were earlier heirs of Greek thought. Now it became freely and directly available. No wonder that Renaissance thinkers came to regard the Middle Ages simply as an obstacle standing between them and the pure knowledge of the classical world. The ages of Gothic superstition, which was all the 17th and, still more, the early and middle 18th century could see in the Middle Ages, were so regarded because they blocked the light of classical culture. But this survey has taken us well beyond the transitional period. In the next chapter we shall examine, in some detail, the new movement and its consequences for literature.